Arthur Beaumont was once a man whose name alone could bend the city skyline. He built towers of glass that touched the clouds, but inside those towers, his heart had grown hollow. Once hailed as a genius of industry, he now sat alone in a mansion so quiet he could hear the clock mocking him with every second. He had wealth beyond imagination, but he didn't have trust. He had influence but not love. So he made a decision that would shock the world, to disguise himself as a homeless man just to find out who would marry his son for love, not money. But why would a billionaire risk his pride for such a test? How far would he go to prove his point? And what would happen when his own heart became the subject of the experiment? Arthur's story begins not with power, but with silence. In a room filled with memories of victory, he sat hunched over an old cassette recorder, pressing play, on a voice he could never forget. Arthur, the voice whispered, soft and broken. If you keep testing people, one day you'll find what you fear the most, someone who passes. It was his late wife, Margaret. She had died years ago, but her words never left him. He had tested her loyalty once too and lost her in the process. That night, her voice echoed through the mansion like a ghost's warning. Outside, thunder rolled. The rain came down in sheets, tapping against the glass walls that looked over New York's endless glow. Arthur stared at the city he owned, and for the first time, it looked like a prison. He saw a man below, huddled under a broken street lamp, trying to stay dry beneath a torn blanket. Arthur whispered, almost to himself, "Once upon a time, that was me." Because it was true. Before the suits, before the billions, Arthur Beaumont had been a boy who slept under bridges, chasing the dream of never being cold again. Poverty had been his teacher, betrayal his graduation. Now in his final years, loneliness was his only companion. He turned toward the mirror, and what he saw wasn't a billionaire, it was a tired man pretending he hadn't lost everything that mattered. The reflection asked him a question his money never could. Would anyone love your son if he had nothing? Arthur poured his whiskey down the sink, his hands trembling as he reached for an old duffel bag. Inside he found a torn jacket, boots that smelled of damp leather, and a cap that could hide his face. He put them on slowly like armor. "Let's see who truly loves you, Ethan," he murmured. When the elevator opened, the storm greeted him like judgment. He stepped out into the rain, the city swallowing him whole. A billionaire father had just become a ghost, invisible, watching, testing the world that had once worshipped him. And somewhere out there, his son had no idea that love itself was about to be tested. Ethan Beaumont wasn't like his father, and that was exactly what terrified Arthur the most. Where Arthur saw numbers, Ethan saw faces. Where Arthur built empires, Ethan built trust. He believed love didn't need proof, but compassion did. On a gray Tuesday morning, while the city rushed to make money, Ethan walked into a shelter that didn't have any. The sign outside read Haven House, warm meals, warmer hearts. The paint was peeling, but inside, laughter echoed through the cracks. "We don't pay much," said the shelter director, a tired woman named Marla, "but we pay in peace." "Peace is enough," Ethan replied, with that disarming smile that made people believe him. He didn't use his last name here. Just Ethan, a volunteer with no past. The son of one of the richest men alive was about to learn what life felt like when you couldn't afford breakfast. But Ethan wasn't the only one seeking something that morning. In the corner of the shelter kitchen, stirring soup like she was mixing memories, stood Sofia Ramirez, a nurse who'd lost more than she ever admitted. Her eyes told stories her lips refused to speak. She volunteered not to save others but to forget herself. Her mother had died waiting for a hospital that cared more about insurance than people. Since then, Sofia vowed she'd never let anyone feel invisible again. Their first conversation wasn't cinematic, it was clumsy. Ethan spilled soup, Sofia laughed, and somehow that laughter lingered longer than it should have. She thought he was just another kind soul. He thought she was the proof that kindness still existed. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, Arthur Beaumont, now dressed as Mr. Harris, was watching the world from the shadows of an alley. The billionaire had become a phantom, unrecognizable beneath the dirt and rain. He'd chosen a bench near the shelter intentionally. From here he could watch people without being seen. And that's when he saw them, Ethan handing out food, Sofia smiling at strangers. Something twisted inside him. He should have felt pride, but instead he felt irritation. "Too trusting," he muttered. "The world will eat him alive." Arthur noticed the way Ethan's eyes followed Sofia. There was admiration there, maybe something deeper. But Arthur's mind turned it into suspicion. He didn't see two good souls finding connection. He saw another test waiting to happen. As night fell, the shelter emptied. Sofia handed Ethan a coat someone had left behind. "It's going to be cold," she said. Don't play hero without a jacket. I'll try, Ethan smiled. But it's hard when you're surrounded by people who already are. Outside, Arthur tightened his coat and watched the pair disappear into the fog. A flicker of lightning illuminated his face, and for a moment he wasn't sure whether he saw admiration or jealousy staring back at him from the window's reflection. The test had officially begun. But what Arthur didn't know was that while he tested love, life was quietly testing him. Arthur Beaumont had once watched cities rise from blueprints, but now he watched people from the shadows. From his cold bench across the street, he turned his designer lenses into binoculars, his luxury watch into a cracked wristband. In a strange twist of irony, the man who once ruled skylines now studied souls. Every morning Ethan and Sophia arrived at the shelter. They never noticed the quiet old man under the awning. He was always there, same coat, same cap, same silence. To them he was invisible. But to Arthur they were his living experiment. At first he just observed. The way Sophia served food before she ate herself. The way Ethan smiled at people who'd forgotten how to smile back. It should have inspired him, but it irritated him instead. Compassion to Arthur looked like weakness wrapped in hope. They don't know what the world really costs, he whispered into the rain. He began writing in a small water-stained notebook, a habit from his business days. Only now, instead of numbers, he logged character. Ethan, naive. Sophia, too pure. World, unpredictable. But fate has a sense of humor and it never lets a test go untested. One night after the shelter closed, Sophia found the same homeless man slumped against the alley wall, Arthur himself, though she didn't know it. He'd been coughing violently, the cold finally catching up to his aging lungs. Without hesitation, Sophia rushed to his side. "Sir, you need warmth," she said, draping her scarf around him. Arthur tried to speak, but the sound came out as a rasp. His disguise had become his prison. Ethan soon joined her, helping the old man inside. "Let's get you some tea," Ethan said, smiling gently. Arthur felt a strange ache, not from illness but from irony. The very compassion he'd mocked was now saving him. Later, as he sat with a cup of tea trembling in his hands, Arthur studied Sophia up close for the first time. Her kindness wasn't calculated. Her eyes didn't carry greed, just weariness. She looked at him not with pity but with quiet respect. That unsettled him more than hatred ever could. When she stepped away, Arthur muttered to himself, "No one is this good, not without wanting something." Meanwhile, miles away, another story was quietly unfolding. Grace Holloway, a sharp-minded journalist known for chasing corporate ghosts, had just received an anonymous tip. Arthur Beaumont has disappeared. Her editor brushed it off. "Billionaires vanish all the time," he said. But Grace felt something colder, a sense that this wasn't a disappearance, but a confession in disguise. She pinned his photo to her investigation board and whispered, "Let's see what you're really hiding, Mr. Beaumont." Back at the shelter, Arthur stared out the fogged window, watching Sophia laugh with Ethan over a broken coffee pot. It should have been heartwarming, but to Arthur it was ammunition. He coughed again, blood speckling his sleeve. The watcher was being watched, not by others but by his own conscience. Ethan Beaumont once believed honesty was the strongest bond between two souls, but he was about to learn that love sometimes grows inside lies. Days turned into weeks at Haven House, and the air between Ethan and Sophia began to hum with something unspoken. They laughed more easily now, shared lunches that stretched into conversations about dreams, hers simple, his secret. But under every smile, Ethan carried a truth he couldn't tell, that his father was Arthur Beaumont, the missing billionaire the city was quietly whispering about. Sophia's story came out one evening as the lights dimmed and the last plates clattered into the sink. The shelter's hum softened, replaced by the rain tapping against tin roofs. She spoke quietly like someone confessing to ghosts. "My mother used to say love doesn't need diamonds. It just needs someone who stays." Ethan listened. Her mother had died in a public hospital hallway because the system had labeled her as uninsured. The nurses walked past, the doctors never came. Sophia had watched love die on a cold bench, the same kind Arthur once sat on as a boy. That memory had carved her life into two halves, before hope and after anger. "So, I made a promise," Sophia said, looking down at her trembling hands. "I'd never depend on anyone who measures love in dollars." Ethan wanted to tell her everything then, that his family was that system, that his father's money had probably built the hospital that failed her. But the words froze in his throat. Truth, he feared, might destroy the only real connection he'd ever felt. And just beyond the shelter's cracked window, Arthur Beaumont, dressed as Mr. Harris, was listening. He had followed them inside, pretending to need warmth again. As Sophia comforted him, Arthur staged another test. He faked a stumble, falling hard onto the floor. Without hesitation, Sophia rushed to him. "Careful, sir. You could have hit your head." Arthur smiled weakly. "You're too kind," he whispered, eyes scanning her face. Too kind to be real, he thought. When Ethan helped lift him, Arthur's gaze met his son's for a brief, dangerous second. Ethan didn't recognize him, but Arthur saw everything. Pride, fear, love, and he hated it all at once. That night, when the shelter emptied, Arthur scribbled in his notebook under a flickering streetlight. Sophia, empathetic but naive. Ethan, idealistic but blind. Test escalation required. Meanwhile, Lila Delgado, the maid's daughter who worked at one of Arthur's penthouses, saw a newspaper headline, "Billionaire Arthur Beaumont missing for 3 weeks." She scoffed. "Men like him don't disappear," she said to her friend. "They hide to make us dance." And in a way she wasn't wrong. Back at the shelter, Sophia fell asleep at her desk, exhausted. Ethan draped a blanket over her, watching her breathe with the kind of peace money couldn't buy. He whispered, "If this is what being poor feels like, I think I can live with it." But outside in the rain, Arthur smiled through cracked lips. "Let's see how long that lasts," he murmured. Because for the first time in his life, Arthur wasn't building skyscrapers, he was building traps. Love grows quietly but scandal shouts. One morning, Haven House woke up to whispers instead of greetings. Phones buzzed, screens flickered, and a headline swept across every feed like wildfire. Shelter nurse caught dating secret billionaire heir, gold digger or guardian angel? The photo was blurry but cruelly timed, Ethan and Sophia sharing a laugh, her hand brushing his arm. The internet didn't see compassion, it saw calculation. Vanessa Green, Ethan's ex-girlfriend, glamorous, entitled and dangerously bored, had struck first. She'd been scrolling one night when she recognized Ethan in a viral video from the shelter's charity event. The thought that he'd traded her world of penthouses for a girl who served soup was more than she could stand. "Let's see how your saint handles the spotlight," she whispered, hitting post. By noon, Sophia's phone was buzzing nonstop. Reporters crowded outside the shelter, their questions like daggers. "Are you after the Beaumont fortune? How long have you been lying about who he is?" Sophia didn't even understand what was happening until Ethan arrived, face pale, phone in hand. "Sophia, they know." She stared at him. "They know what?" Ethan hesitated, and that pause said more than words ever could. The truth she'd built her trust on began to crumble. Meanwhile, in a coffee shop across the street, Arthur Beaumont, still in his disguise as Mr. Harris, stirred his drink calmly as chaos unfolded on the TV behind him. The headline replayed over and over, each time twisting the knife. He didn't post the story, but he didn't stop it either. In fact, he'd quietly tipped off a blogger weeks before, just to see what Sophia would do under pressure. "If love is real," he whispered to himself, "it survives humiliation. If not, it was never love at all." But even Arthur wasn't ready for how brutal the world could be. Online hate is a beast that never sleeps. Within hours, the shelter's donations dropped. Sophia was asked to take a temporary leave to protect the center's reputation. The same hands that once clapped for her now pointed fingers. When she left that night, it was raining again, as if the city itself was ashamed. Ethan followed her down the empty street. "Sophia, please, I never meant for this." "You lied to me," she said, tears mixing with rain. "You didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth, but you let the world destroy me." Ethan reached for her hand, but she stepped back. "I don't know who you are anymore, Ethan. Maybe I never did." From the shadows, Arthur watched the scene unfold. His son standing alone under a streetlight, love bleeding out in silence. For a second, even he felt the sting of what he'd caused. But guilt is a luxury the powerful rarely afford. Across town, journalist Grace Holloway pinned a fresh headline to her investigation board. "Missing billionaire's son involved in viral shelter scandal." She stared at the photo and whispered, "If the father's testing the world's about to test him back." Pain doesn't announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it just waits for silence to settle. Sofia Ramirez sat on a park bench that night, clutching her phone like it was a wound she couldn't close. The world had decided who she was. A gold digger, a liar, a woman who used kindness as camouflage. She wanted to scream that none of it was true, but truth is quiet and lies are louder. A car slowed beside her. It wasn't Ethan's sleek sedan, it was a rusted taxi. When she looked up, she saw Mr. Harris, Arthur in disguise, watching her through rain-blurred glass. "You shouldn't be alone, miss," he said softly. Sophia gave him a tired smile. "Alone is honest," she replied. "No one can betray you when there's no one left." Arthur wanted to tell her she was wrong, that love existed beyond betrayal, but the words wouldn't come. Maybe because he wasn't sure anymore. Across town, Ethan was losing his own battle. His apartment looked like a confession. News clippings on the floor, unanswered calls blinking on his phone. He tried to call Sophia again, but she didn't pick up. The shelter had shut its doors on both of them. Love had turned into exile. He whispered to himself, "I wanted to prove that love could survive without money, but I think I only proved that money can destroy love." Back in the alley, Arthur's cough returned, deep and raw. He bent over, clutching his chest, pain slicing through him like an overdue verdict. The world blurred at the edges. Sophia noticed and rushed to him, instincts overpowering heartbreak. "You need a doctor," she said. "No," he rasped. "Doctors don't fix what's already dying." She wrapped her arms around him anyway, helping him sit. In that moment she didn't see a stranger, she saw humanity itself, fragile, stubborn, and scared. Later that night, when Arthur stumbled back to the shelter's empty lot, Daniel Moore, a quiet veteran who swept the floors there, found him struggling to breathe. "You think you're testing people, old man?" Daniel said, lighting a cigarette. "But maybe you're the one on trial." Arthur looked up, confused. Daniel's eyes had the calm of someone who'd seen too much. "Empathy ain't weakness," Daniel continued. "It's the only thing that keeps us from becoming machines." Arthur said nothing. He simply nodded, as if the truth had been spoken in a language he hadn't heard in decades. Meanwhile, Ethan found Sophia the next morning outside the closed shelter. She didn't look angry anymore, just tired. "You don't have to forgive me," he said. "I don't," she answered quietly. "But I still care. And that's the problem." As she walked away, Arthur watched from the corner, his vision swimming. The empire he'd built was intact, but everything else, love, trust, faith, had collapsed like glass under its own weight. He whispered to himself, "The test worked, but I failed." And with that, he fell to his knees, coughing blood into his trembling hands. The experiment was killing its creator. Every empire loves a good performance, and Arthur Beaumont had built his life on them. But tonight, the curtain was coming down. The invitation read, "Beaumont Foundation Annual Charity Gala. A night for the forgotten." The irony was surgical. Arthur himself had become one of the forgotten. But rumors of his return filled every whispering corner of the city. No one knew if he was dead, missing, or simply hiding behind another mask. Inside the ballroom, chandeliers glittered like frozen tears. The rich smiled with empty grace while cameras hunted for sincerity. Ethan arrived in a modest suit, not to celebrate but to confront. Sophia came too, not as a guest but as a statement. Her presence was defiant, a woman accused by the world but unwilling to disappear. "You don't have to be here," Ethan whispered. "Yes, I do," she said. "People should see who I really am." For the first time in weeks they stood side by side. But forgiveness, like wealth, doesn't return easily. The orchestra softened. The host tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "our evening's keynote donor has requested to speak. A man whose generosity has shaped this city, Mr. Arthur Beaumont." Gasps rippled through the crowd. And there he was. Arthur walked slowly onto the stage, not in a tuxedo but in his homeless clothes. Mud-stained coat, tattered cap, shaking hands. Every phone in the room lifted. Every whisper became thunder. He took the microphone. His voice was gravel but steady. "You all thought I disappeared," he said. "You were right. I vanished on purpose." He paused, scanning the sea of faces. "I wanted to see if love still exists when money doesn't. I wanted to know who would love my son for who he is, not what he has." Cameras flashed like judgment. Ethan froze. Sophia's eyes filled with disbelief. Arthur's confession poured out like broken glass. How he disguised himself, spied on them, even manipulated the chaos that destroyed their peace. It wasn't about cruelty, he claimed. It was about truth. But truth, when twisted, cuts both ways. Sophia stepped forward, trembling. "You didn't test love," she said softly. "You tested your own emptiness." Her words hit harder than any scandal ever could. The audience turned, murmuring. For the first time in his life, Arthur Beaumont looked small. Ethan moved closer to his father, voice cracking. "You wanted to teach the world about honesty, but you lied to everyone, even yourself." The applause that followed wasn't for Arthur, it was for Sophia. Her integrity shone brighter than his billions. Arthur stepped back from the podium, chest heaving. The lights above seemed to dim, his vision fading into gold and blur. He tried to speak again but his knees buckled. Ethan caught him before he hit the floor. "Dad." Arthur looked up at his son with eyes that finally held regret. "You passed the test," he whispered. "But I didn't." And as cameras rolled, the billionaire who had tested love collapsed under the weight of his own experiment. Arthur Beaumont once built towers of glass and steel, but now his empire was reduced to the beeping of hospital machines. The news of his collapse spread faster than his wealth ever did. Headlines shifted overnight from mockery to myth. Billionaire posed as homeless man to test son's love life. Cruelty or genius? The moral experiment of Arthur Beaumont. The world couldn't decide whether to hate him or worship him. But inside the quiet hospital room, there was no debate, only silence, the kind that waits for truth to be spoken. Arthur's son Ethan sat by his bedside, eyes red but steady. He hadn't left in days. "You should rest," said Sophia softly from the doorway. She had come, not for closure, but because compassion doesn't end where pain begins. Arthur opened his eyes slowly. His voice was barely a whisper, but his words were heavy with clarity. "I thought I was teaching you both something," he murmured. "But I was only running from my own loneliness." Ethan took his father's hand, not as a billionaire's heir but as a son. "You didn't have to test love, Dad. You just had to feel it." Arthur smiled faintly. "Maybe I never learned how." Sophia stepped closer. "You can still make it right." Arthur turned to her, eyes full of guilt. "How do I ask forgiveness from someone I broke?" Sophia hesitated. Then quietly, "You don't ask for it. You live in a way that earns it." The room fell silent again, but this time it was peaceful. The man who'd once demanded control over everything had finally surrendered to something greater, humility. Days passed. Arthur's condition worsened, but something changed in him. He asked Ethan to reopen the shelter, not as a publicity stunt but as a promise. "Let the money heal what I hurt," he said. When the papers reported that the Beaumont Foundation had been rebuilt as Haven House Community Trust, many called it his redemption. But Sophia refused to attend the press conference. She didn't want to be the symbol of his repentance. Instead, she returned quietly to her work, serving meals, comforting strangers, building trust again one soul at a time. Arthur watched her on the hospital TV, smiling faintly. "She's stronger than all of us," he said. That night, as Ethan dozed beside him, Arthur scribbled one final note on a piece of paper. "Love isn't proven by stripping people down, it's proven by lifting them up." He folded it, slipped it into an envelope marked for Ethan and Sophia, and rested his hand on his chest. The next morning when Ethan woke up, the monitors were silent. Arthur Beaumont, the man who tested love, had died with a smile on his face. But the world wasn't done with his story. Not yet. Because love, once exposed, becomes a mirror, and everyone wants to see what reflects back. Arthur Beaumont's funeral was not a quiet affair, it was a battlefield dressed in black. They came in fleets of limousines, journalists and investors, distant relatives and distant hearts. Cameras lined the gates, microphones ready to harvest grief like profit. To the world, Arthur was now a symbol, the billionaire who'd faked poverty to find truth. But behind the eulogies and flowers, old wounds were reopening like fresh scars. Ethan stood at the front, trying to hold composure. He wasn't mourning just a father, he was mourning the version of himself that still believed in fairness. Beside him, Sophia watched silently, unsure if she was saying goodbye to a man she pitied, respected, or resented. Then came the reading of the will. In the grand Beaumont estate, the lawyer's voice echoed across the marble hall. "To my son Ethan Beaumont, I leave nothing but the truth. Everything else belongs to the one who understood compassion without price." Murmurs spread instantly. Sophia's head snapped up. "What does that mean?" she whispered. The lawyer continued, handing her an envelope, the same one Arthur had written before his death. Inside was a single note and a signed document transferring the majority of the Beaumont estate, billions in assets, to the Haven House Community Trust under Sophia's name. Gasps erupted. Some called it justice. Others called it betrayal. Ethan froze. His father had given him no inheritance, only a message. He gave everything to her? Vanessa's voice pierced through the crowd, venomous. The woman who ruined his reputation? The room fractured into chaos. Reporters stormed forward. Former board members demanded answers. Ethan stood, trembling, torn between gratitude and anger. "He was trying to teach me something," he murmured. "But I don't know if it was love or punishment." Sophia, overwhelmed, turned to leave, But Grace Holloway, the journalist who had been following the story since the beginning, stopped her at the door. "It's not over," Grace said, sliding a manila folder into Sophia's hands. "You should see this." Inside were photos, time-stamped images from months earlier, of Arthur speaking secretly with Grace in alleys, in coffee shops, in places no billionaire should be. Notes scrawled in his handwriting: Stage 3, reveal the world's reaction. Truth must hurt before it heals. Sophia's pulse quickened. He planned everything, even his own exposure? Grace nodded. And maybe even his death. The revelation struck like lightning. Was Arthur's illness natural, or was it the final act of his grand design? Ethan stared at the will again, voice trembling. So none of it was random? Not the disguise, not the chaos, not even her? Sophia looked at him, tears welling. "He didn't test me, Ethan. He tested you." And the whole world watched. Grace folded her arms. The story's not over. The real question now is, who's brave enough to tell it? Outside, the sky darkened over the mansion. The Beaumont legacy, once built on power, was now burning under truth. But somewhere in that smoke was the shape of a twist no one saw coming. Arthur Beaumont was gone, but his shadow was still alive. Weeks after the will's reading, the world had already turned his story into entertainment. Talk shows debated his social experiment. Documentaries called him the philosopher of wealth. But behind the headlines, something quieter and darker was unfolding. Sophia sat alone in her new office at the Haven House Trust, the charity Arthur had left her. Boxes of legal documents surrounded her, but one small sealed envelope lay on the desk, stamped to be opened 30 days after my death. She hesitated. Then she broke the seal. Inside was a flash drive and a short handwritten note. "You think the test ended with me? It didn't. You're holding its final stage. Reby." She inserted the drive. A video flickered to life. Arthur appeared, thinner than she remembered, his voice frail but deliberate. "If you're seeing this, Sophia, then the world already thinks you've inherited my empire. But what they don't know is that you were never the subject of my experiment. You were the control." He paused, eyes cold and brilliant. "The real test was Ethan. And the world itself. I wanted to know how far people would go to judge love, to destroy it for sport. I leaked the story. I fed the tabloids. I built the outrage. And I watched society fail." Sophia's breath caught. "You started it?" she whispered to the empty room. Arthur's image smiled faintly. "But I also left you everything to fix what I broke. That's the only way balance returns, through kindness that survives cruelty. If you refuse the inheritance, the trust dissolves, and the fortune returns to the corporations that once exploited the poor. If you accept it, you become what I never was, the proof that empathy can hold power without corruption." Tears blurred her vision. Arthur had turned his death into a moral trap, a final chess move from beyond the grave. Across town, Ethan received his own letter. It wasn't money, it was a confession. Inside, Arthur admitted that his supposed illness had been treatable, but he had refused care, staging his own decline to make the world believe in his repentance. "I couldn't live as a ghost of my mistakes," the letter read. "But maybe my death could buy the truth I never lived." Ethan sank to his knees, whispering, "You didn't test love, Father, you weaponized it." Yet days later, when Sophia held her first press conference as head of the Haven House Trust, she said something no one expected. Arthur Beaumont's story isn't about wealth or cruelty. It's about what happens when we stop believing that compassion can survive in a world obsessed with proof. The audience fell silent. Even the camera stopped clicking for a moment. Then, just as the lights dimmed, Grace Holloway, the journalist, looked down at her phone. An encrypted email had just arrived from an unknown address. Subject: "You think the story ended?" Attached was a recent photo, Arthur Beaumont, walking barefoot through a crowded street in another country, smiling under the same old coat. Grace's eyes widened. "He's alive."